Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. So just for those who don't know, this is a weekly podcast and webinar that myself and Peter Wright do, basically just discussing the things that come up in the news that's related to our line of work each week. So Digital Law is a small law firm based in Barnsley in the UK, and we specialise in things to do with data protection, data privacy, and everything to do with how technology and law integrates. So basically, I'll just pass you over to Peter now, just to give you some more information and to introduce himself.
Thank you, Laura. So my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and managing director of Digital Law, and indeed we'll be discussing stories in the news this week in relation to law and technology. And we've got quite a few, I think this week in particular, quite a few big stories. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. So kicking off today's discussion then with a story from the EU Commission. So the EU Commission have now introduced in a regime for illegal content in the Digital Services Act. So I think Pete said earlier that we don't know everything about the Digital Services Act at the moment. I think the context of that is coming out on the 2nd of December, if I'm correct. But basically, this is an article about the European Commission and how they are introducing fines and sanctions for platforms that are repeatedly violating new obligations and managing illegal content through online as part of the forthcoming Services Act. So this will move the EU's efforts in this field closer to certain measures across the bloc. So for example, in Germany, they have a similar system where under the German Network Enforcement Act, which introduced fines up to 50 million euros for systematic failures to remove illegal content. So I think certain platforms will be placed under this new obligation, and they have to prove that they are dealing with the spread of illegal content as well. And there is another link that I haven't actually included anything about this on the slide, but there is something about gateways, which Peter knows a lot more about than I do, so I'll pass over to him now.
Indeed, thank you, Laura. And I think it's important to emphasise that we're trying to sort of work out here what's likely to be in the EU's Digital Service Act, which is indeed being published on the 2nd of December. But the implications are very significant for how the world's largest corporations, these tech corporations, operate. The first big thing, as Laura, you've quite rightly said there, comes down to how content is handled. So far, these large platforms like, for example, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, other social media platforms have grown on the basis that they host people who are account holders who can then post things online. But the platform says we are not publishers, so therefore, if someone looks at something that is printed in, say, a newspaper, you can sue the newspaper. But if you see something on Facebook that you don't like, you can't sue Facebook. This act is trying to say that actually, as publishers, social media corporations and tech companies do have to take some responsibility for the content that is hosted on their sites. Now, this isn't necessarily getting to the point where we're saying that, they could be sued for a post that one person thinks is potentially carrying defamatory information, or those who are perpetually offended about everything get angry about. We aren't talking about that. What we are talking about here is things like where we've got illegal content, copyrighted content that could be construed as, say, carrying out as actually have material relating to criminal offences. There's a lot of content that gets put up sometimes that relates to crimes being actually carried out. Let's not forget there's been some really horrific things filmed in the last few years where people were doing live streaming of the commissioning of terror offences, which meant that there were these horrific videos up online until they were taken down. In effect, we are saying here that the platforms would have to bear more responsibility for the content that is hosted on them. So if it does contain images of abuse, images of people being assaulted, of offences being carried out, then therefore they have to take more responsibility for taking this stuff down, as well as bearing in mind that the effect that these platforms have had on things like companies that rely on copyright. So therefore, things like illegally copyright, the illegal circulation of movies, of music, of creative material. We're also talking about clamping down on that. So very significant implications for, as the Act suggests, how digital services are handled online. Now, that's the first part of it, the first link. The second thing is slightly more difficult to quantify. They are called ex ante rules, that the idea being that at the moment, when it comes to some of the competition issues around how these platforms operate, in particular Apple, Amazon, etc., people end up making complaints from a competition law perspective about how they're abusing dominant market position only after they have abused that position. Instead, this Digital Service Act is hoping to flip that round to, in effect, say that platforms actually have to bear in mind their actions on the market. And the justification for this is to say that platforms like Amazon, like Google, are actually providing mass users with access to a market. Let's not forget that an awful lot of the products that are sold through Amazon are little independent retailers or individuals using that marketplace. Same with Google and Google's marketplace. And in effect, they're saying here, look, you need to think about implications on how that marketplace operates and not wait for either a complaint or a regulator to turn around and say, hang on, you shouldn't be doing that. So on both of those limbs, we're talking about two massive changes really in how these big corporations have grown in the marketplace so far. We're actually looking at significant changes in terms of how it will be regulated. But I must emphasize, of course, this would only be in Europe. These corporations, if briefly thinking about this globally, they are facing moves for greater regulation in the United States in particular. The current presidential administration, the Republican administration, was starting to sound like they were starting to keen on introducing greater regulatory curbs on them. Certainly the potential incoming, and he says potential because of course on the 13th of November, when we're recording this, the current Republican administration, they have not conceded the election, so let's not count any chickens yet. And we don't know what's going to happen potentially. So, but any incoming Democratic presidential administration have indicated strong intentions to actually change the regulatory landscape for some of the big tech corporations. So we're looking at changes in regulation in the EU and potentially in the US as well. Let's not forget that when it came to data protection, Europe did introduce GDPR. That has been adopted by, in certain manners, similar stricter levels of regulation have been adopted in places like California and in other countries around the world. A similar thing might happen here with regards to this. So the changes in the market that the EU is looking to do could lead to similar trickle-down effect in other countries around the world as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're correct there. Like what comes in the EU usually comes in right across the world eventually, in some effect. And I think that takes us on nicely to the next story, which is kind of linked in a way about not waiting for a regulator to come on and complain about what they're doing. And one of the big, not tech firms, but yeah, one of the big firms that is basically abusing their power. So the Amazon have actually been charged by the EU Commission rule. Amazon have been charged by the European Commission, in regards to abusing EU competition rules. So they've been charged for using sales data of independent retailers, selling through the site to illegally gain an advantage in the European market. And I think the main point here is to focus on that the European Commission aren't really bothered about how big they are. It's the fact that how they're practicing in the market. So in the last third quarter of the income that Amazon took in 2020, their income has actually tripled from last year, and it is now $6.3 billion. So that comes from their Amazon selling site and obviously the Amazon buckets and everything, so their data storage online. However, the Commission have highlighted the problem and saying that the problem isn't the size of the company, but the business practices which are appear to be illegal by the growth of its competitors.
Indeed, thanks for that, Laura. I think you're absolutely right. Europe doesn't have a problem with Amazon being the size it is, but it's the potential abuse of its market position that it does have a problem with. Let's not forget that Google was fined a few years ago for what was seen as the illegal manipulation of its search results, so that certain traders ended up dropping down those results, whereas Google's own products and Google hosted things ended up coming far higher on the results.
Yeah.
We're talking about here a kind of similar thing where Amazon is being accused of almost abusing its own marketplace by gaining an illegal advantage over its own independent retailers that are actually selling through its own site. And the fact that they could be gaining that advantage in the European marketplace as a whole. So that's where the EU is looking to say, look, we aren't entirely happy with these sharp practices, which could be construed as trying to stop the growth of Amazon's competitors. And when we look, and that's an incredible figure, isn't it? When we're saying in the third quarter, so this is over a 3-month period, Amazon's income is $6.3 billion. You know, there are countries for whom their GDP isn't that large, and it's incredible to think of the sheer size of this. And in particular, let's not forget 2020. An awful lot of industries have been disrupted this year because of the shift to doing digital business more by necessity, because of everything from lockdowns in Europe to shelter-in-place orders in the United States to other restrictions that have been introduced all around the world because of COVID-19. And therefore, to see that, you know, Amazon is therefore turning over a huge amount of money, and potentially, while we're saying that's tripling its income in that period compared to the previous year, we can see the practical effects of that hugely mushrooming dominant position. And therefore, that's why the European Commission is saying, well, hang on, we are not convinced here that you are, despite that growth, we are not happy with some of the practices that you are offering. So they are therefore talking about clamping down on some of these perceived practices, which could be giving it what, as far as the European Union is concerned, would be an unfair advantage.
Yeah, completely. Because, like you said, this year has had an effect, and the tripling in their profits is probably from this year. But clearly, there's been some type of like pattern as well, showing that their products are, like you said, higher up on their Amazon search. Because I think in the article it said that they are using the information they're getting from their small marketers about people's buying trends and things like that, and then using that to basically market their own products. So instead, when you go onto Amazon and you think, oh, I'll buy from a nice independent retailer, you go on and the Amazon's choice, or at the top, is one of their own products rather than someone else's.
Exactly. And it's coming down to that sort of abuse of the platform. But also, Laura, you made a very good point as well when introducing this story, saying let's not forget there's an awful lot of Amazon's turnover there is coming from things like Amazon Web Services. Those Amazon subscriptions now, where you've got Amazon in turn hosting everything from different apps to e-commerce platforms to other items of digital commerce on Amazon's system, illustrates that they are just seeping into all different aspects of the market, and the more that they control of it, the more that they can manipulate it. And the fact that they can then potentially be using and abusing that platform is therefore what Europe's got a problem with.
Yeah, absolutely. So that takes us on to our next story then. So I think we mentioned this last week about we should have just a full section about data breaches because they're becoming ever so more popular. But this is one regarding a hotel chain, but it's not actually in any of the articles that I read. They've not actually mentioned what hotel chain it was, but basically millions of guests' files have been leaked from various hotels around the world, and these have been exposed due to a misconfigured Amazon Web Services S3 bucket. So these records include sensitive data, including credit card details, a lot of names, things to do with where the person stayed, how long they're away for, and even things to do with special requests. So that could give away things to do with health and religious data as well. So the breach was actually through Prestige software. So this was the cloud hospitality, which is used by hotels to integrate their services into systems such as online websites like Expedia and Booking.com. So the incident actually affected 24.4 gigabytes worth of data, which is quite a lot of data. And some of those records were actually going back to 2013. So there was storing data for a lot longer than they should have, especially when they're having to comply with not only GDPR but regulations to do with payment details as well.
Indeed. Thanks, Laura. And it's quite shocking, this. I mean, last week we were talking about Marriott and the fact they've been fined £18 million for a data protection breach. In this instance, Prestige Cloud Hospitality seems to be a platform that's got its fingers and toes in an awful lot of different hotel chains. They are subject to GDPR, so we'll be looking at one of the European data protection regulators will no doubt be investigating and potentially fining them for this. And the scary thing is the sheer volume of information. I mean, in that article it lists that we aren't just talking about names and addresses. It's things like the CVV numbers off the back of credit cards, which of course you have to enter for the transaction to go through. So that has been compromised. It's things like dates when people have been away from home. It is special requests that people make, things like dietary requirements, or you might make a request due to that betrays issues around your diet, with regards to medical issues, with regards to race and ethnicity as well. So we're talking about potentially very special category data, very sensitive data, and that has just been breached. I mean, 24 gig, and in a world of data protection breaches where we've had over several terabytes a week before now, 24 gig doesn't sound much, but when we realize that it seems that all of that data is of this very sensitive personal data, you start to see the seriousness of the breach. It's also the fact that we've got records, as it says there, going back to 2013. I mean, one of the key principles of GDPR is you only keep data for as long as is necessary. What on earth meant that these records were being kept for such a prolonged period of time? We always talk about the fact that you shouldn't keep records for longer than necessary, and certainly no longer than 6 years, which is statutory limitation. But if you can't use that limitation argument, arguably you should be getting rid of the data much sooner, and for it to be on there for such a very long time has created this risk, which sadly has been realized, all due to a misconfigured Amazon bucket. And the final bit on that is just that, and we were talking about this earlier, weren't we, Laura, that you tend to think with a big corporation like that, surely this platform would have been secure.
Yeah, and I think at the bottom there's just a statement from the Prestige software company, and they said that the company was actually storing years of credit card details from hotel guests and travel agents without protection in place. And I think a lot of people assume like a big company like Amazon would have encryption on their servers by default. And I think when we've been carrying out data protection impact assessments for different clients recently, we've realised that a lot of these companies, these big organisations, which you would think that their backbone would be to protect people's data, they don't actually have any of that in place, unless you specifically ask for your data to be encrypted or encrypt it yourself. Then your data won't be protected.
Exactly. I think very often people tend to think, oh, we're on Amazon's cloud, we're in the Microsoft cloud, surely it's secure and encrypted. Well, no. Unless you specifically check and ensure that it is, it isn't very often. And it's the danger. It's one of the things that I think very often as lawyers we're taught not to make assumptions. You never want to find yourself relying on that word saying, well, I assumed. But I think an awful lot of people tend to see, well, it's a big corporate involved here, I can assume that good standards are in place. And the answer is no, you cannot. You have to establish for your own satisfaction that your data is being stored securely, and indeed where it is being secured. And if you can't answer both of those questions, or they won't give you that information easily, that should give you cause for concern. And in this instance, Prestige relied on the fact they were using Amazon, and clearly there was a misconfiguration in there for a prolonged period of time that no one knew about.
Yeah, absolutely. So just moving on to our next story, kind of staying on the same grounds really. So this is regarding a Crown Prosecution Service that they are guilty of serious data breaches. So prosecutors are routinely guilty of serious data breaches that endanger the public by disclosing addresses of people who report crimes. So after reading this article, basically there's been a review by the CPS into a number of cases, and out of 700 cases, it was found that 98 of those cases actually contained security breaches. So a lot of these is not necessarily a cyber breach like we see by people hacking into the servers and everything like that. It's the prosecutors themselves actually forgetting to do something. So they're forgetting to redact the data or not redacting it correctly. So one example that was actually in this article was in a photograph of a victim's injuries showed their date of birth on a hospital wristband. And another one of these was just basically a document where they'd not correctly redacted the document without, and given that personal data out in court, obviously, without actually gaining the permission of the client as well. So yeah, it's just basically them not redacting and not doing the basic principles that they should be doing, basically.
Indeed, thanks, Laura. I mean, unfortunately, we've got a series of data protection breaches we're talking about today. This one I found the most depressing, unfortunately, because we're talking here about, in the majority of instances, we are talking about people who are the victims of crime having their personal data breached, not through, you know, a widespread hack or you know, some malicious third party, but actually being breached due to sheer poor standards and poor practice across the UK's Crown Prosecution Service. This report kind of gives you the impression that, you know, it's not like, for example, oh, someone's lost a flash drive with some data, or someone left a load of information in the back of a cab or something by mistake. It appeared to be so endemic that in speech marks it says there had been speech marks a significant number of data security breaches, close speech marks, full stop, and they can't even you know, give us more than just these very bits of generic information because they're simply too numerous to go into, which is kind of the most, you know, 700 cases, 98 breaches, and your heart bleeds for the people who have been involved in it. This poor person who was in hospital and had their hospital wristband information, not to mention details of their injuries, circulated. I mean, no one really wants to have their private medical records circulated for general consumption by the public or anyone else. The whole point is your medical records are private between you and your doctor. And the fact that this is when people are vulnerable after potentially being on the receiving end of a criminal offence being carried out, people need support and they need to rely on the institutions of the state like the CPS and not feel CPS is then just going to take that data and just throw it in the air and see who sees it. You know, at least we're in a country where they actually do investigate this stuff and check and see as a problem, and hopefully they'll try and do something about it. But when we're hearing about this in this day and age in 2020, this shouldn't be happening. It really shouldn't. Not in that volume. 98 instances.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things as well is that right at the top of that page, where it says that people's addresses who are actually reporting the crimes are being leaked. So these might be very serious crimes, and they're just putting more people at risk of being there in the long run, and it might have a negative effect of people actually coming forward and reporting crimes.
Exactly. What if you think that they aren't even going to protect the information of those who come forward and say, oh, this has happened, that's happened, then indeed, why would you want to come forward if you have no faith that when law enforcement say, oh, don't worry, as a victim of crime, we can keep you safe? What's the basis to believe it based on this? I think we'll have to stop talking about this one. It's simply too too depressing. And now, having said that, we're going to go on to another data protection breach now as well.
Yeah, so this is the last story of the day, but so this is a new ICO fine that got announced today. So the ICO have actually fined Ticketmaster UK Limited with a £5.2 million fine for failing to protect customers' payment details. So the ICO found that the company had failed to put appropriate security measures in place to prevent a cyber attack on a chatbot which was actually installed on its online payment page. So the data breach actually took place in 2018, and Ticketmaster took quite a few weeks or maybe even months to realise that this had actually taken place. And the data breach actually included names, payment card details, expiry dates, CVV numbers, and potentially affected 9.4 million of Ticketmaster's customers across Europe, which included 1.5 million in the UK. So investigators found that 60,000 payment cards belonging to Barclays Bank customers had been subject to known fraud, and another 6,000 cards were replaced by Mondo Bank as there was suspected fraud as well.
Thanks, Laura. So yes, it's Ticketmaster, and they're the ones who provide tickets for various everything from music festivals to different comedy gigs and different things. I think you're even saying that you've ended up buying tickets through Ticketmaster in the past.
Yeah, so I bought my Creedfields ticket last year. It's supposed to be going this year, but obviously cancelled, so for next year now.
Yeah, and after this, you might want to try and find a different agency than Ticketmaster, perhaps. But
yeah,
the thing is here. I mean, that's a sizable fine. It's already saying something in how the world is changing. That, you know, pre-GDPR, the most the ICO could fine was £500,000, 1.25 million. Given that we were talking about Marriott being fined 18.5 million last week, suddenly seems like small beer, but it's still a significant amount. But I think the biggest story here is the fact that we've got at least 1.5 million people in the UK whose personal data was involved in this. Let's not forget that they now could potentially make a class action and then sue Ticketmaster. So if each of those 1.5 million people was to basically put together and make a claim, they may end up being able to claim probably the best part of £2,000 to £3,000 each. Add that together, and suddenly Ticketmaster is liable for hundreds of millions of pounds to pay out in compensation to those affected by the breach. Let's bear in mind here as well, obviously we're talking about sensitive data, payment card information, once again, people's financial detail, those very important CVV numbers as well. So I think that if this did go to a group action, if a court did get involved, they would look and say, look, they're quite serious data here. So I think you'd certainly be looking at something like £2,500, £3,000 per data subject affected. So Ticketmaster, the headline here is that 1.25 million, but the actual total liability that Ticketmaster may end up having to fork out for could be an awful lot bigger. Yeah,
and I think we've discussed class actions quite a lot recently, so they are becoming even more popular, especially to do with data protection breaches. And I think the fact that the ICO have actually already fined them, the class action has got something to rely on, basically, if it does end up coming about.
Exactly. You can't exactly argue that you aren't liable if you've been fined by the ICO. So you're really, all they can hope to do is mitigate their loss at that point and say, well, you know, we were doing as much as we could be expected to do. But given the size of this, and given the fact that the breach was ongoing and they failed to identify the problem, you can't see much in the way of grounds that Ticketmaster can mitigate this. So they're just going to be trying to limit the damage, really. But at a time where, I mean, Laura, you've just made the point. Ticketmaster gets its money from selling tickets to public events. How many public events are happening at the moment? Zero. Exactly. I know an awful lot of people in the events industry who cannot look at organising, like you say, vaccine might be on the way, but are we going to get things like Creamfields and other big festivals in 2021? Unlikely. So
probably not.
Ticketmaster in a really difficult situation to try and be able to pay for this. Where's the money going to come from when you aren't turning over anything?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%. It's not a good time for them, but they should have. Hopefully, they'll learn from this in the future.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I think that brings us to the end there. But I can't help but think, Laura, that we've gone through. Unfortunately, it's almost sort of ending on a bit of a downer with such big stories around data protection breaches there. I know we might end up having to have sort of, cyber hack of the week, but perhaps we need to start working on the and finally story, which has something happy like a dog on a skateboard or something. But, we'll have to have something, because when unfortunately, apologies to our listeners, when you've got so many stories like this, it doesn't leave you feeling great about data security. But let's just hope that organisations, as you say, Laura, learn from these errors, and that people's data is properly kept safe and secure in future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these data breaches and cyber attacks and everything is just becoming even more popular. I think at the start, when we started doing these episodes, and now we're on episode 20, the amount of cyber attacks that we was talking about, if we got one a week, we were lucky. But now we're just getting them every single week. There's loads of them every single week, and now like this full episode has basically been talking about data breaches.
Indeed. So you're quite right, and that's the positive then, is the fact that this is episode 20. So thank you to any of our listeners who've stuck with us that long, or who have joined us along the way. But we'll be continuing to do these discussions each week, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more positive news to share with everyone next week.
Yeah, hopefully. So just want to remind you as well about the special offer that we've got on for our listeners at the moment. So this is our GDPR compliance manual for legal practices. So it's initially on sale in 2018 for £195, and is now down around 50% for £99. So this is available in digital copy and hard copy as well, for just an extra £5 for postage and packaging. So I'll just pass over to Peter to give you a bit more information about the product.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So yes, if you've listened aghast to stories of data protection breaches in this week's episode, and you don't want your organisation to be on the end of a fine or a class action, can I strongly recommend our GDPR toolkit, which gives you the forms and templates and checklists to help you demonstrate compliance with GDPR and heavily reduce the possibility of being on the end of a data protection breach, or being unable to demonstrate good compliance with GDPR when you're then speaking to the regulator, and hopefully minimising the likelihood of finding yourself with a fine at the end of the process. So that manual gives you all of that useful practical guidance, as well as plenty of advice about what good practice looks like, and also what poor practice looks like, so that you can make sure your organisation doesn't make the mistakes that we've ended up talking about this week.
Great. So that's everything for this week. Thank you once again for everyone listening. So we will be back next week for episode 21. And just a reminder for those who didn't catch us live, it is available on demand every single week on Spotify, on our website, and through our YouTube channel as well, and any other podcast channel that you like to listen to your podcast on. So thank you once again for listening, and we'll hopefully see you next week.